Hello everyone, welcome to the video on impacting for novices and people who want to catch up on the basics again. So in this video, I'm going to explain four things. Firstly, what impacting is. Then I'm going to talk about skills and kind of like give you a metaphor for how to think about impacting and debating. Thirdly, I'm basically going to give you ideas on how you can find impacts. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about how you can place this in debate. Because it's good to know how to impact, but also being able to actually place it in debate makes it even better. So what are impacts? Again, we're going to start with the very nice paint drawing that I made. In the end, an argument is basically explaining why you go from emotion to your impact. And that's oftentimes, the end point of your argument. It is the motion will lead to Z. And overall, the idea is that the Z is a statement which is overall either good or bad. And it's the answer to the question, why is this specific thing so important? And in this, nice metaphor, it is a drawn treasure chest, because that's what you always want to get at, a treasure chest that's very valuable, because impacts are very valuable in debate and are sometimes forgotten, even in quite good debates. So another way to think about this is by thinking of skills. So impacting is just putting an argument on a skill and a specific side of the skill. So let's say you are a government team, you can have two of these blocks here. And at the moment you have blocks that are either like heavier or in total are heavier, then you're going to win the debate because then it is tipping to your side. And that's basically what you're doing. And the ways you can do this is by either making your blocks very big, as you can see here, but you might also just have a lot of impacts, a lot of blocks, which aren't as big. Time-wise, it's oftentimes easier to just have a couple of blocks which are quite big than having 100 impacts. But maybe you're very good and you're able to actually explain all those 100 impacts to a certain extent, and then it's going to be very difficult to weigh against this. So overall, in the very basics of impacting, there are three scales, as one could say, or three dimensions that one can win on. So firstly is the largeness of the group. I think this is quite intuitive, right? If I say I'm gonna, the motion will steal 10 euros from 100 people versus, on the other side, maybe 10 people will lose 10 euros, then we think that, the harm on the 100 people is more important. But the second thing is also quite important, which is how substantial the change is. And sometimes this also referred to like how big the impact, how impactful the impact is, which is a very bit, weird maybe to say it, but it is maybe intuitive in everyday life. So, for example, I can take from 10 people 100 euros, or I can take from 10 people 1 euro. Then the fact that I'm taking 100 euro has a larger impact. But that's what we would say in real life. But in debating, it's maybe easy to think about how substantial that change is for the group, because clearly 100 euros is more than 1 euros, and therefore the graveness of the thing happening is larger at the moment you take away 100 euros. And thirdly is the idea of a care factor, which is a bit difficult maybe to explain in abstract. But basically the idea is, how sad do we think this group is? So let's just think for this, for example, let's say you are a parent, then in general, if your kid is crying, then you find that worse than if another kid is crying, because you have a special bond, you have a special responsibility, or even just an emotional connection. And I think that's basically the idea, care factor. How much do we care about this group? In this specific context, it is always possible to think of a principle. Because at the moment you maybe think for principles, for example, the state ought to care about this group more because of X principle, then you create a care factor. So this is also a way wherein principles can come into play in arguments. Now that kind of leads you to the question, what is the biggest impact ever? And that is all babies die. Very large group, very substantial change, and everyone cares about babies. So it's one of the least controversial groups to talk about. So in essence, debating can be described as trying to get as close to explaining why all babies die, if that's possible in emotion. But yeah, maybe another way to kind of like visualize the three dimensions that I have is just this way when you actually think of skill. So if you think about the first dimensions, the amount of people, it's just how tall is your block. And then if you want to think about the second dimension, right, the gravity of the harm, sometimes also called the frequency of the harm, so how often will this happen, that can then be the width. Alternatively, you can have this gravity slash frequency, or how long something is lasting, as separate axes, so a separate dimension, and then you can draw it even in 3D. I think there's just oftentimes a very big interlink, right? So if something happens more often, or it happens for a longer time, that immediately makes the gravity of something happening larger. And then a care factor is just explaining where it is placed on the scales. So I don't know how much you know about physics, but the further a block is away from its axis here, the more force it puts on this side. And if you have a bit hard, if you find it hard to think about this and visualize it, just think about a door. And if you try to push a door further away from the hinge, it's easier to do that than if you do it very close to the hinge. It's a, a home physics experiment that you can do. Now, let's go on to the next slide. So again, this was all still quite abstract, even though I gave a couple of examples. So let's just think about the example that I've discussed so far, which is this has legalized all drugs. And then the argument, there are going to be less overdoses. So pause the video, think for yourself a bit, how would you impact this argument? Okay, I hope that you've had enough time. Here are some ways that you can explain this in these 3 dimensions, as I've highlighted before. So the first one, largest of the group, is maybe a bit more difficult to explain or to really, make work. But ways to do it is explain why drugs are easily accessible and why people have, for example, a want for these drugs. So you explain why people have both a capacity to get drugs, which is, for example, via the internet, or the fact it's very easy to have connections to someone who has drugs. But also then secondly, why they have the motivation to do so. So why would a person want to do drugs in the first place? And then you can explain why people are much more likely to want to kind of like relax and maybe forget about their stressful situations, and therefore they're much more susceptible to drugs and addiction. Then how substantial is the change? This is the most intuitive, because overall we think that death kind of is bad. And you can also just make this maybe even less absolute, where you say there are just a lot of long-term health effects. Of course, just saying long-term health effects is very, not maybe as abstract, but still quite abstract. So here you can talk about the fact that at the moment you take, for example, specific drugs, then it also means that parts of your body needs to be amputated if you overdose, because of circulation of your blood being fucked up, or your lungs basically being unable to breathe long term, or go into more detail how this can actually look like and why it would be bad for the person. And if you want to explain why death is really bad, you can just say, you kind of need it for any kind of human right that you have. Now, why? And now also let's think about the last dimension, which is care factor. So you can explain that these people are to a certain extent not really actors who wanted to do this, and much more likely to be a victim of circumstance. So you can say that why they did drugs in the first place. So you can explain this in the form of, these are maybe specifically in poorer communities or more disenfranchised communities, where again, at the moment you have explained that oftentimes this happens when there's a lot of stress or when there are a lot of external factors pushing you to go into it. That means that it's very difficult for them to opt out. But you can also talk about this in a biological way, which is oftentimes susceptibility to addiction and to seek stimulating drugs and stimulating context is oftentimes determined biologically. So it's very difficult for people to go against this, which means it's already, more of a mentality of a victim, and therefore we already care more about it as people in general. This can also work on a subconscious level, where if you just use the language of victimhood in your arguments, then they just already think like, this is a bit more sad than maybe you just say, they use drugs and then they die. Because then they might say, well, it's kind of like their own choice. Also, you can just explain why the state has failed them in the first place. So this comes to, again, oftentimes in disenfranchised communities or disenfranchised neighborhoods, there's sometimes more drugs. They explain why that is linked to the state. And they say that as a state, that we should try to help these people because we have failed them. So again, you kind of like have a duty to them, and therefore, as a state, you should care for it, and therefore the state should do this. Now, how do you find impacts? So overall, this is oftentimes linked in with prep, because it's oftentimes easier to think of impacts than it is to think of mechanizations or framing or all this kind of stuff. So just really think simple. What will this motion lead to? And this can just be very direct. So, for example, legalization of drugs just means stores will be opened. And then from that, okay, there are more stores. What can I then explain as an impact on this? And then you can talk about tax revenue, or you can talk about anything else. But another specific way to think about this is just consider which groups are impacted. And sometimes it is difficult to maybe think about this because, again, you have sometimes no idea what the motion is about. You can then just go around and just think about specific stock groups. So you can talk about companies, you can talk about parents, you can talk about, how this would maybe look in developing nations versus developed nations. You can think about how politics will engage with this, how the media will talk about this, how this will be talked about in social media, and just, visualize it for yourself. And in that way, oftentimes it's easy to think of impacts. Also, it can be quite nice that at the moment you have an impact to kind of expand it. So let's just say you have a specific impact that you have thought of, then you can maybe consider specific subgroups of this impact. So this oftentimes can be done with like, okay, we have this group in general is going to be harmed, but this also is specifically in developing nations and explain why they're more vulnerable there. Where you can talk about maybe ethnic minorities and then explain why this is specifically uniquely so harmful also for ethnic minorities or maybe for immigrants or something like that. But also, maybe you can also explain why it is very likely that the specific group is going to join. So it's a bit different in the sense that when you talk about a subgroup, it's often very intuitive that the subgroup is there. Whereas at the moment you can extend the impact, you explain why new people will join the group that you already is going to be harmed, the status quo, very intuitively going to be harmed. It just means that you have a larger number of people that can be harmed. This is quite abstract. We're going to have an example later on. Also, there's parallel impacting, which is maybe a bit more of an advanced tactic. The idea is basically that instead of just having a lot of your arguments be dependent on another argument, and a lot of the impacts be dependent on impacts, you're going to have independent impacts. So if you look, for example, here in this picture, it is your impact one that you already have, and then you're going to build on that impact by adding another treasure chest, which is a specific subgroup. But it is dependent on you proving impact one, which means that at the moment somebody explains why you don't get access to it or why maybe it's not as important, it becomes more difficult to win. If you, on the other hand, have two different impacts, which maybe have some same steps, but means that the other team might, need to do more weighing, it is easy for you to take it over them. And also if you have some impacts that you make along the way, so along the steps, that means you also have more secure impacts. So let's say you do this for every part. Let's say you're able to do that time-wise. Then you already have an easy impact that certainly stands after you've proven your first burden. Then you also have a second burden that you need to do. And if you also add an impact there, you have another impact, which is maybe not as certain, but it is still something that stands within debate. And if you then have your large impacts, which that's what you want to go for, and then explain why this is so important, then if there's another team and you have a very big impact here, they now either need to rebut a lot of these burdens to make sure you don't get access to the impact, but also it becomes difficult weighing wise because they need to spend a lot of time on weighing why your big impact isn't as important. And if they do that, then they might miss out on the other impacts that you have for certain. I want to note that, again, it is important to keep time in your head when you are thinking about doing this in prep time, because you do only have 7 minutes. And if you do this for maybe 2 articles you want to bring, you're gonna have a lot of problems with time. So think about this strategically, try this out at different times, but also don't forget you still need to explain why they are important, do some weighing for a judge to be willing to take this into consideration for the deliberation. Now, yeah, that is basically the idea. This is also a more advanced tactic than maybe one that we start with, which is just expand what you already have. Now let's just take these ideas and consider the argument again. There are going to be less overdoses when you're going to legalize all drugs. So I want you to think about how are you going to stack the impacts? So add on the impact that we already have, but also how are you going to maybe think of parallel impacts? Okay, I hope that's enough time. Let's go to the next slide. So if you're going to stack impacts, then the way to do this is also consider, for example, people who are close to people who overdose. So for example, family, parents, friends, all this kind of stuff. So then at the moment someone dies, it's not just, oh, it's sad for that person, but it's also for people around them. So this is a clear way to expand it. But I think also here you can just talk about a specific subgroup. We already did about this when talking about a care factor, which is where you consider a specific group within the group of people who are overdosing, such as impoverished people, and you explain why maybe the state has failed them, then you're already doing, again, a specific subgroup here. I think what might be also handy to note here is when you are considering a specific subgroup, it might be important to highlight this to judge. So you say there's a very large group who overdoses for these and these reasons. Let's consider a specific subgroup. This is a very important subgroup, but note panel, there are still more people who also still die, which is still a very big impact and all this kind of stuff. So you can do weighing on different scales, I would say. So let's just now think about parallel impacting, which is something that's a bit more difficult. If you remember from the mechanization workshop, one of the things that you talk about is unsafe production. The fact that at the moment it's illegal, you can't have labs which can be regulated, which means there are oftentimes unsafe productions. But independent of getting to the overdose point, you can also make this a harm in of itself. Because then you can say, look, at the moment that a person has a lot of drugs and oftentimes also have byproducts of making the drugs, they oftentimes just dump them in rivers or dump them in like a local water well, all this kind of stuff, which means that it is bad for people in the environment because their crops might be hurt, their drinking water might be poisoned, but also it's just bad for the environment, which is something that's independent of the argument of people who will die of overdoses. But it is something that you can add because it's one of the burdens you have. Another thing that you can talk about is people who are producing these drugs oftentimes are in bad environments. And again, you can say this is a bad impact. This is they are harmed with harsh chemicals. They oftentimes have a lower life expectancy because there are oftentimes fumes coming free in the process, which is going to decrease their life expectancy. And also here you can then extend this impact, and then you can say, look, who are oftentimes making these drugs? When it is, in the case of large cartels or like large organized crime, they're oftentimes poor people or people who are human trafficked and then are making these drugs in abandoned places or in very remote places. So that you can make it even, sadder than just, again, people have chemicals that might decrease their life. You're saying also these are people who are very vulnerable, have been taken advantage of, which already is language which makes them more sympathetic. Also, I think that there's a way that you could say that at the moment you have, for example, a person who is more willing to, for example, go have drugs, that you can say, or like go to a hospital or go to the police to have their drugs tested or to, get help when they're overdosing or when a friend's overdosing, then this is not in and of itself a way why you're going to have less overdoses, but it also might then link back in the way that these hospitals and governments engage with drug users in the first place and how they see them. Because you can say that the only reason why they see them in the status quo is when things have gone really badly, at which point there's much more likely for this to be stigmatized within the work, like within hospitals and social work, but also in the media and how governments are going to perceive this as well, because people who vote for them only see specific things in the news. That's maybe also a way that you can talk about this, which is not an impact that you can do in a specific part of the burden, but something that you can have as a parallel impact on why people maybe are more likely to get help when they are having problems with drugs. Okay. Now, placing in debate. I think this is also important because it's very easy now that you have learned both how to mechanize something and how to impact it to just be like, okay, I have thought of mechanizations, here are reasons, here are structural reasons, here's an impact, here's why this group's important, and then just leave it at that and don't place it in debate. The problem is everyone in the debate has impacts, and you oftentimes win by explaining why your impact is bigger. Again, this is very intuitive because your judge needs to consider why your impact is big, and just you saying it's big doesn't explain then why it's bigger than anyone else's. So the way to explain that why it is bigger is by using those three skills. So say, yes, maybe we talk about less people when we're talking about overdoses, but we should care about this group because the state has neglected them, but also the harm is significantly larger. And then you can also explain why maybe one specific skill matters more than the other. And here's where, again, principle justifications can be quite strong. So at the moment that you have a specific group which has been neglected by the state, and you make a really, really strong principle on why it is that these people should be helped, then even if you have overall maybe a smaller group, and maybe even the impact of itself maybe not as grave, and then you explain why principle, doing principally correct things is more important or the most important thing ever, then at that point you're able to win the debate, even if you lose on other two dimensions. But overall, I would recommend trying to take, preferably you'd win over all three dimensions. So it is the biggest, it is the biggest change, it is the biggest group, and it is the biggest care factor. But that's oftentimes not the way that debates are balanced, in the sense that you oftentimes do need to bite a bullet. Most likely there is an argument that will win on one specific clash. So you can just bite the bullet and not just waste 2 minutes of explaining why you also win on that dimension anyway, but rather say, okay, sure, let's say they win on this dimension. I have 2 other dimensions to win on, and here's why they outweigh them. Also, there are some unique ways that you might be able to weigh specific impacts. One of these things is the speed of change. So let's say you are having an impact or a debate, and one of the clashes is who will get less overdoses. And a person might be able to prove, for example, why in the long term you might get some plans, but you can explain why this specific policy will have more certainty, will happen quicker, and therefore you're more secure that it's going to help more people. Then that's a way to weigh over it. And you can do this in and of itself by explaining why speed is important. But I think, again, this is also oftentimes an implicit way of using the other dimensions, right? Because the idea of doing something quicker is that in the end, you help more people, because the people who have been harmed in the meantime, before you have implemented that regulation that in the end has been able to help these people, is just a group that you can now have access to. But also maybe a way to think about this is think of uniqueness of impact when you are weighing your impacts. So they might say, oh, there are alternative policy that we can use to actually win, or like to actually get the same impacts. But say here is why uniquely this policy is good or bad, or why uniquely this harm is so important. Then that's something that can just make the debate less symmetric. Again, you can have a whole workshop again on weighing and how it works, but these are just maybe some basic ways that you can place it in debate, just to make sure that it's not just, you making arguments in the vacuum. Now, again, let's just go into the example that we've already had. So this House will legalize all drugs. And now, because we're going to do placing in debate, I'm going to give you 2 things that have been said in debate. So the argument 1 for proposition is you're going to have less overdoses. Argument 2 from opposition is you're going to have more drug usage in general. Now, let's just say that both of these teams have proven these arguments sufficiently, and you don't want to do any rebuttal because that would take significantly more than the time than maybe weighing, because people have been very extensive in the way that they have met these things and the way they've proven their burdens. So how would you then weigh less overdoses over more general drug usage? And how would you do the opposite thing? So weigh general drug usage over overdoses. Okay, pause the video further if you still need some more time to think about this. Let's consider what I have, thought of. So let's say you want to explain why overdoses are more important on general drug usage. I think here is a point where you bite the bullet. So here you say, fine, we lose this clash. The number of people on the overdose side most likely will be not as big as more people who are going to do drugs. I think this is quite intuitive, and I think you can maybe do some weighing here on what is more likely, but I think it's also one of those things where it becomes very muddy very quickly. So then you can just say, fine, I don't want to try to win a very muddy dimension that's going to take way too much time for me to weigh. Rather, I'm going to think about fairness. So again, I think it is very intuitive to think that overdoses, which lead to death, are oftentimes worse. So a way to explain this is that life is a necessary condition for any other human right that you have. So you cannot speak, you do not have access to your free speech if you're dead. You don't have, you can't have the right to vote or anything else that we as humans find important if you are dead. And again, also you can, maybe branch out the severeness when you say, when you talk about, um, how this person would die. So if you explain this is a very painful death, then this also is something that intuitively becomes quite bad. Again, you can go to maybe more illustrative detail, but I will forgo that in this video. Another thing is you can maybe think about a care factor. So a way to do this is maybe think about, again, the weighing that in the status quo and in the budget house, people who have, are poor, maybe are forgotten by the state or haven't been done justice by the state. They are going to take drugs anyway, but now they're going to have less overdoses. So, you practice. So that's one way to kind of do it. And I say that other people who are going to join maybe more middle class or high class people, and we don't necessarily care that much about them. That's one way which already, can be intuited from the way that I've impacted things before. Here's another way to maybe impact this is at the moment you make it legal, people are overall more informed. And then you say, at the moment they are more informed, their choices are more linked to free will or their own rational decision. At which point, if they have bad consequences, we don't care because they have been informed because of it, before it. So again, here the intuition is we allow people to smoke, for example, even though it's very bad for the lungs. Now you can say, what happens on the flip side? If it is illegal, people can't be informed really, because you can't say that at the moment an individual has been is consuming illegal drugs, that the drug dealer is informing them of what is inside of these drugs, or even there isn't as much discussion about what the side effects really are of drugs in the first place. So there are some, campaigns such as Dare in the US, which is explaining, drugs are overall bad, but there isn't a discussion what drugs really do. At which point, at the moment, you have been, for example, you have tried one drug, you've experienced the positive sides, you don't really get any information on what really will do on your body long term because there is no discussion of this. There you say, because of that, people can't be informed, and they often also have no alternative. They can't choose between different drugs, so they don't know what kind of different drugs and how they could work. So in extent, you say these people are therefore more vulnerable or should care more about it. And therefore, because they aren't able to rationally interact with this, they are much more likely to be coerced by people, or we think that this choice is bad for them. And therefore, we think that it is better or more important to actually have more people who are informed versus not informed. And then because we think the choices that they have made when they were uninformed were unfair to them, we should help this group. And because we should help this group, we should do this, we should legalize these drugs, which is a specific way, which is also quite unique because it's quite difficult for opposition to be like, no, 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 we're going to make it illegal, but we're going to make extensive information about what drugs do and what the effects are of which dosage, as well as the fact that it's very clear that a drug dealer on the street won't tell you what's inside of the drugs. So this is a very clear, a unique impact or a unique way that you can weigh this, which isn't symmetric compared to maybe here are reasons why a lot of people are going to do more drugs or why there are a lot of people who are doing overdoses. So that's maybe a way to think about this. I haven't, explained anything for the vice versa. I think you can do it yourself, or alternatively, you can just place that in the comments. So that was actually quite a lot. So we discussed overall what impacting is, how you can impact things, better by talking about the three dimensions that you have, which is the amount of people, how severe the change is, and how much do we care about this group. And then we also discussed how you can think of these impacts, how you can make them even larger, as well as how to place them in debate. In the next video, I'm going to combine all the things that we've talked about, which are like mechanization, impacting, placing in the debate, and all this kind of stuff, and then explain how you're going to structure this in your speech and how you're going to structure your arguments. I hope that this was clear. I hope that you had fun thinking about these motions and these arguments. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments. And then I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.